In December 1952, London was gripped by a lethal environmental catastrophe that would later be remembered as the Great Smog. For 5 days, a dense, yellow-black fog blanketed the city, reducing visibility to mere feet and turning the air into a toxic stew of soot, sulfur dioxide, and acidic particulates. By the time the smog lifted, an estimated 12,000 people were dead, and tens of thousands more suffered long-term respiratory damage. Yet in the immediate aftermath, British government officials insisted the deaths were the result of an influenza epidemic, not air pollution. This claim, repeated in press briefings and official statements, was a deliberate misrepresentation. Cabinet papers released half a century later revealed that authorities knew the true cause but chose to conceal it. Fearing economic disruption to the coal industry and the political cost of implementing pollution controls, the Great Smog was not a sudden or unpredictable event. London had long struggled with air pollution, a consequence of its reliance on coal for heating, power, and industry. The city's geography and climate made it particularly vulnerable to temperature inversions, where a layer of warm air traps cooler around the pollutants within it close to the ground. In early December 1952, such an inversion settled over London. Combined with cold weather and the widespread burning of low-grade, sulfur-rich coal, the result was catastrophic. The smog was so thick that visibility dropped to a few yards. Public transportation halted. Ambulances couldn't navigate the streets. Theaters canceled performances because audiences couldn't see the stage. Even indoor air became hazardous. Hospitals quickly filled with patients suffering from breathing difficulties, chest infections, and other respiratory ailments. Deaths spiked dramatically, especially among the elderly, infants, and those with pre-existing conditions. Yet the government's initial response was muted. Officials downplayed the severity of the crisis and attributed the surge in mortality to a seasonal flu outbreak. This narrative was convenient. It deflected attention from the environmental causes of the disaster and avoided implicating the coal industry, which was central to Britain's post-war economy and energy policy. The decision to blame influenza was not based on medical evidence. In fact, doctors and public health experts were already raising alarms about the role of air pollution. Pathologists noted that many of the victims had died from bronchial infections and asphyxiation, not influenza. The Ministry of Health received reports from hospitals and coroners indicating that the smog was the primary factor. But these warnings were ignored or suppressed. Internal government communications, later declassified, showed that ministers were aware of the environmental cause and chose to mislead the public. The rationale for the cover-up was rooted in economic and political concerns. Britain, in the early 1950s, was still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Coal was the lifeblood of the economy, powering homes, factories, and transportation. The National Coal Board, established in 1947, was a major employer and a symbol of post-war reconstruction. Any admission that coal smoke had killed thousands would have triggered demands for regulation, investment in cleaner energy, and a reevaluation of industrial policy. These measures would have been costly and politically unpopular. Moreover, the government feared that acknowledging the environmental disaster would undermine public confidence. The smog had exposed the vulnerability of urban infrastructure and the inadequacy of existing health protections. Ministers worried that admitting fault would provoke outrage and erode trust in their leadership. Instead, they opted for silence and obfuscation, hoping the crisis would fade from memory. But the smog did not fade. Its impact lingered in the lungs of survivors and in the conscience of a city that had witnessed mass death in peacetime. Public pressure mounted. Environmental activists, scientists, and journalists began to challenge the official narrative. Studies conducted in the years following the smog confirmed its deadly toll and linked it directly to coal combustion. Epidemiologists documented the spike in mortality and traced it to the days of the smog. The influenza explanation unraveled. In response to growing outrage, Parliament eventually passed the Clean Air Act of 1956. The legislation introduced smoke control areas, restricted the burning of coal in urban centers, and promoted cleaner fuels. It marked a turning point in British environmental policy and acknowledged, albeit belatedly, the dangers of unchecked pollution. But the act came too late for the thousands who had died in 1952. The full extent of the government's deception only became clear in the early 2000s. When cabinet papers from the period were declassified, these documents revealed that ministers had discussed the true cause of the deaths in private meetings and had chosen to suppress the information. They feared the political fallout and the economic consequences of reform. The papers included memos from the Ministry of Health, the Home Office, and the Prime Minister's office, all acknowledging the role of air pollution and recommending against public disclosure. The revelations sparked renewed debate about government accountability and the ethics of public health policy. Critics argued that the cover-up had cost lives and delayed necessary reforms. They pointed to the parallels with other environmental disasters, where economic interests were prioritized over human welfare. The London fog cover-up became a case study in the dangers of politicizing science and the consequences of ignoring expert warnings. The legacy of the Great Smog and its cover-up continues to resonate. London's air is cleaner today, thanks to decades of regulation and technological innovation. But pollution remains a pressing issue, especially in urban centers. Diesel emissions, industrial activity, and traffic congestion still pose health risks. The lessons of 1952 are more relevant than ever. As cities around the world grapple with climate change and environmental degradation, the story of the London fog cover-up is not just a historical episode, it is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that governments can and do conceal inconvenient truths, especially when powerful industries are involved. It underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and the role of science in shaping policy. And it honors the memory of those who died, not from influenza, but from a preventable environmental disaster that was hidden from them by those entrusted with their protection. In the end, the Great Smog of London was more than a meteorological anomaly. It was a man-made tragedy, compounded by official denial and institutional failure. The cover-up delayed reform, obscured the truth, and betrayed the public trust. But its exposure also paved the way for change, forcing a reckoning with the costs of industrial progress and the value of human life. The fog may have lifted, but its shadow remains a reminder of what happens when silence is chosen over truth.